Today we will be doing an off-the-cuff commentary on a video by Izo, an anarcho-capitalist. His video presents a non-liberal case against borders. In this video we will not try to argue whether a country should have borders or not, or whether a country should have an unrestricted immigration policy or not. In this video we will try to look for answers of two questions. First, whether authoritarianism is always bad, and second, whether freedom is always good. There will be perhaps a follow-up to this video in which we will try to look at practical data and scenarios. So let's begin.
So, I support the abolition of borders. Yeah, I know, but please just hear me out. Firstly, much like the issue of police brutality, I absolutely fucking hate the way discourse around this issue is shaped in mainstream platforms. You have the side which is against borders being 99% made up of a bunch of spurging adult children.
Agreed with that.
Who do nothing but shout slogans in idyllic demagoguery, which very rarely, if ever, address the actual issues being brought up by their opponents. And on top of that, they lie constantly. All of which merely gives the side that supports borders a constant stream of ammunition to use against their opponents, and little challenge to their narratives. Because, again, 99% of the people who oppose borders that have a large platform are retards, and the other 1% are either pushed to the side entirely or are too scared to actually say anything due to the fear of being lumped in with the tards. So I suppose there's no better place to start on this issue than with principles and ethics, since this is the easiest part to go over, and without it a crucial point may be lost because of the annoying habit advocates for borders have of dismissing critics who point out the various inconsistencies with their beliefs by saying, "Well, no, we're just being pragmatic."
That is the issue with only those people who are liberty-minded in most cases but back off from certain liberties. This is not an issue with the people who do not agree with the Enlightenment, because this has been a problem since Enlightenment. Since Enlightenment, people adopted a value of liberty, but they never were fully into it. And you can see still this in many so-called liberal countries, which have those things as crimes that completely fall in the face of liberty, and which do not even recognize the right to retain most of one's own income, instead distributing it to other people through government. This is not an issue for those people who have no problem calling themselves authoritarian, or who are called pejoratively statists, because they never were liberty oriented in the first place, so they do not need to back off certain liberties and be inconsistent with their principles at the same time.
This is particularly common among Nozikian minarchists and Hoppians.
I'm not sure whether I would put Hoppians there, but yeah, you see that this is the problem with liberty-minded individuals.
Which, no, bordertarians are literally not, since this is merely just a repackaging of an appeal to common sense fallacious argument. The only thing they've changed is the buzzword that they use, and dismissing criticism by condescending to your opponents and implying that they're somehow being impractical without demonstrating why you're correct or why their criticism is invalid by simply force-feeding the audience what you want them to think of your ideas is not pragmatic by definition. People have dominion over themselves since they are in control of their own agency, which by extension means that they're entitled to every product of this agency, speech, property, association, etc. To deny even one of these is to deny every fundamental human right along with it. Why?
There is but one theory of human rights. Not all human rights are based on the idea of dominion, agency, or self-ownership, which Hazel will be talking about in just a moment. For example, some theories say that human rights come from God or the Creator. In fact, US Declaration of Independence explicitly mentions that the inalienable rights come from a Creator. Some other people hold that human rights come from the nature, the essence of humankind, and thus these rights are inviolable because these rights are attached to the essence of human beings. So they do not come from the idea of self-ownership, or agency, or dominion over ourselves. This is entirely a libertarian or rather anarchist approach to human rights.
Well, think about it. If I don't have control over who I associate with, then who does? Someone else has to be declaring dominion over me in order for that to be the case, and all of my rights come from the presupposition that I have dominion over myself. So if my right to free association, for example, is violated, then I necessarily don't have the right to anything else because I need to have dominion in order to have those rights, and I can't have that without every characteristic of my agency. This is a principle known as self-ownership, and it's
With which I mostly don't agree.
central to every libertarian philosopher's proclamation with
Yes, libertarian philosophers.
the exception of egoists. So it's indeed impossible to support borders or anything that the government does for that matter while claiming to be a libertarian.
I can partially understand that. I won't say that it is impossible, but very hard.
Because all governments claim to have dominion over individual agents and use coercion in order to sustain this. But that's another topic which I've gone over extensively in other videos. The reason this is relevant is that this is an impossible principle to hold, even if you had the most authoritarian person one could conceive of. It would still be impossible to justify holding dominion over another person, since in order to do so, you would need to demonstrate that you have the right to own someone else.
Rights do not work in this way. So basically, rights are those things that are almost non-debatable in the society and which cannot be overturned by a simple majority or simple exercise of power. We do not have dominion over others because we have right to own others. We have dominion over others sometimes because we have power over others, and they do not have the right to escape the consequences of that power or that dominion. Most of the time, in anarchist or libertarian circles, rights are considered the only thing that are present in the society which dictate what should be a societal position, at least in the legal or the physically coercive terms. But that is not how the discourse on the rights has been from centuries. Rights basically are different than laws in a sense that rights are basically non-negotiable and non-debatable laws. These are the laws and that are so essential for society that society affords them a special status. For example, First Amendment and Second Amendment in USA. Just because there are some rights doesn't mean that outside of those rights, coercive actions or any action cannot be performed. Some things are protected by rights and all the other things are reached by a dialectical process in a society. So, if a person does not have the right to not be owned or not be physically coerced, he can be physically coerced by a person. It is not a violation of rights, it is merely an exercise of power. Now, one may agree with it or not, but it is a fact. People are coerced in many situations and have been throughout centuries. Perhaps we may reach a society where such is no longer acceptable, but it will always be a fact of the society because it is an expression of human nature.
Which is impossible, inconsistent, and would fundamentally rely on special pleading. So, with that being said, it's easy to see why border advocates generally don't even try to get into principle and consistency when it comes to the ethics of their position, and if they do, more times than not, they'll point to their opponents doing something unethical or use an ad hominem and avoid criticism of their ideas at all costs.
Posturing. It is performance art, really. Congresswoman Nancy Pelosi and even Hillary Clinton took an early lead in the contest by bypassing public policy questions entirely and moving straight to theology. Here are part of their sermons. Watch. So the same people who support third-term post-viability abortion for purposes of sex selection are now lecturing you about God and sin and the holiness of children.
Third term, post-viability abortion, is basically not a very hard term to understand. Our main point of Tucker and the people who do that is there is a level of pragmatism when dealing with the issues in the society because most people don't care about principles. If you are too much constrained to principles, and this is something that most people do not support in a democratic system, you are just handling power to your opponents. Politics is basically not a game of principles. It is often made out to be, but it is largely based on wooing your population over which you try to rule or over which you try to establish government because people, even if that is a false illusion of power, they have some power in the system because they can vote and change and replace the government. An average person does not think about principles. He thinks about what benefits him, what is in line with his thinking, what does he approve of, and he is not so intellectual as to be looking at consistency of each of his positions. This is why politics becomes a game of pointing the inconsistency of other person because there are so many inconsistency in the position of politicians and it has to be if a politician has to stay in the game. This is an unfortunate consequence, but it is a consequence nevertheless.
But fine, some of you may be saying. Maybe you don't care if what you're advocating for is principled or
Most people don't.
can be justified on an ethical level. And to be fair, yeah, most of the pro-border arguments tend not to presuppose that they're in the ethical right, only that their opponents are unethical. So, for all of this opposition being based on the cold, hard facts and logical deductions based on scientific observation, you'd think that their case would be relatively set in stone.
Facts are different than principles. You might adopt a principle, but it may produce harm in the society, which may be factually established. In that case, whether the principle is worth pursuing, that also becomes a question.
As it turns out, there's a considerable deal of evidence to suggest that immigration is better for the economy and that immigrants don't contribute to crime as highly when controlling for socioeconomic factors. Now, before someone comes along with this counter
One important thing to note here is when controlling for socio-economic factors.
argument, as they surely will do if I don't address it,
Trump wasn't talking about immigrants. He was talking about illegal immigrants.
the distinction between immigration and illegal immigration in the eyes of the government is entirely arbitrary and decided by politicians, meaning that there is no actual difference between the two when it comes to crime and economics, unless you're actually arguing that everyone who decides to come to the U.S. that didn't decide to stay on a waiting list, that's bare minimum expected review time is 1 year, spend the equivalent of $4,000 in application fees, and will more than likely have to wait years more simply because the U.S.'s immigration customs prioritizes family of people who are already living in the United States, and has such a small amount of people who can even be accepted legally, are all gangbangers and members of a drug cartel.
No, but they did something illegal. They broke a law.
This would only be an argument if your critics were stating that you were being xenophobic because you wanted stricter borders, and the reason why is because wanting a more authoritarian border policy is not the same as hating people because they came from a different country. Whereas in the study of markets or crime, you have yet to demonstrate a distinction between the economic effects or representation in crime between legal and illegal immigration. The funny part is that there actually is an economic explanation for why immigrants prefer to come to the U.S. illegally. This is because the crippling bureaucracy in the United States immigration policy has made legal immigration come with a very low time preference and would only be desirable to people who have a ridiculously low opportunity cost. People who are living in third world countries seeking economic opportunity in order to simply sustain a stable living don't have time to waste waiting for politicians to decide that they can come in, and don't have the resources to pay the government's ransom. So,
The difference, or basically you can say an explanation why some people think that illegal immigrants may be more prone to crime is that if they are willing to violate a law to come in another country, they might be willing to violate some other laws. You can in one sense say that they are more bold, that they care less about reputation or being caught. This may not be necessarily true, but it is a tentative explanation.
So illegal immigration is more desirable to immigrants regardless of whether or not the specific immigrant in question has nefarious intentions.
Yes, it is more desirable, and the question becomes whether a person will follow a law against his desirability. If he is willing to do that, it tells at least something about him that perhaps, and it may not be necessarily true, but it is a tentative explanation that he will refrain from doing those actions that may benefit him but violate other laws.
For the sake of time, I won't be going over all of them in great detail, but if you want to check the methodology or to see that I'm accurately representing the data, I will be linking all of the studies that I'm basing my claims off of in the description. And by for the sake of time, I mean I have a lot of studies I'm citing and I'm too lazy to go over all of them, especially when most of them say the same thing and I'm merely presenting them to emphasize how much actual data there is supporting my claim.
The problem with most of these studies is that what they mention in abstract and conclusion is basically misleading, and one must look at the actual tables. Research studies may be biased. A peer review process that has been conducted does not mean that the study is right or has been performed fairly, because a peer review process cannot identify all the problems with the study. But more than that, most of the times in the abstract or in the title or in the conclusion, things are presented way more differently than what the table shows. It is basically a concise summation of the results, and a concise summation of results may, by its very nature, even if it does not contain some logical leap, contain some statements that may give a misleading picture of what is actually true, because the researcher may want to show his claim to be more significant than it actually is. So it might be worthwhile to go to the tables to check it out. But let's continue.
Anyway, a paper published in October of 2013 from Crime and Delinquency magazine found, as stated earlier, that once you control for socioeconomic factors, there is, quote, no difference in crime rates between second-generation immigrants and native-borns.
This evidence is actually quite good. However, this evidence is not complete in a sense that there are other studies that do point out differences in different cultures, races, etc. Now, this evidence surely presents a hurdle to those people who think that one culture is inherently superior to other culture, or that one race or group of people is inherently superior to other people, because it shows that if you account for socio-economic factors, the difference is not huge in this study and the rest. So the idea that some populations are intrinsically bad is actually very far-fetched. However, there is one criticism of this assertion, and that is that the socio-economic factors may also be a feature of a population. So when you try to control for these socio-economic factors, basically you are trying to mitigate the difference which may actually exist intrinsically in a population. For example, the population that is in question may be coming from a culture which is produced because of their propensity towards that culture which is in their genes, which may disfavor education, which may result in higher crime rates. And if you control for that education, you obviously will see that the difference between the crime rates has been reduced. But the difference in education is due to the intrinsic feature of the population. So basically, the conclusion is a little bit misleading.
And, quote, first-generation immigrants commit crime at a lower rate than both second-generation immigrants and native-born non-Hispanic whites in the United States.
That makes some sense because first-generation immigrants will perhaps keep a low profile and not mix with other people in such a way that they commit more crimes.
United States. And in a paper published to the Manhattan Institute in December of 2014, the study found that, quote, a large body of economic literature and government data, of which this paper offers a snapshot, leaves little doubt that immigration is not the cause of the country's current economic woes, but rather is part of the cure to the faster economic growth that the U.S. urgently needs.
One has to see that large body of economic data and literature, but the point is that economic growth is not the best measure to understand whether a particular person will benefit from the immigration. So basically, it doesn't address the problem that people have with immigration.
The reason for this is trivial, like a high school consumer econ student would be able to tell you the problem with the immigrants are taking our jobs narrative. All you need to understand is the basic fundamental function of the labor market to know that this is not true, which all you need to know for that is to know how to read a supply and demand chart, since that's literally what this is. Somewhere, there is always a person who has a need, demand, for a service that would be provided to them by a laborer or entrepreneur, supply. And more laborers means that there are more people with demand, since an increase in the labor pool would also mean that there is an equal increase in consumers. This increase in trade leads to higher interest rates, since more people are investing more money into the economy, and higher savings rates, since more people have more money to save.
This is not so simple. It is true that the increase in population, even by immigration, will mean that the supply has increased, so supply of labor has increased, but it also means that the demand will also increase. But the two effects may not cancel out each other. Consider an immigrant which is earning $100 as wages. Now, this $100 has been lost from the population and is now in the hands of the immigrant. How much of these $100 will he give back to the population? $60, $70? The rest of the money he will keep it with himself. So the population loses $100 but gains $60 or $70 back through the spending of the immigrant. Some portion of those savings the immigrant may transfer back to the country of his origin, to his family who is living there, which means that the country to which the immigrant has immigrated to lost that amount of money to the country to which the immigrant belongs by origin. So there are competing factors, and which factor will dominate is basically dependent on the environment, the immigrant, his skill set, and the compatibility of his skill set to that of what the market currently needs.
Specifically, according to the National Bureau for Economic Research, immigration creates 1.2 local jobs for local workers, the majority of which goes to the native workers.
This statement is true, however the paper is very sketchy, and this statement, though is a conclusion of the paper, does not address the problems that natives have with the immigrants. So perhaps we'll look at the paper in another video, which will be the follow-up of this video. But let's continue here.
The reason people are losing their jobs is not because of illegal immigration, it's because of government regulations on the economy limiting the resources producers have to employ laborers. For example, if someone were to hire an illegal immigrant at $5 an hour and minimum wage where you work is $8 an hour, you weren't cheated out of the job because of the immigrant, you were cheated out of the job by the minimum wage, because the minimum wage reduces the amount of laborers that producers can afford to hire by raising the equilibrium rate of the labor market for that specific industry, which also makes prices go up since there is a scarcity of supply created by the lowered ability to produce commodities for the market. The same demand exists, but less can be supplied, so you end up with a price hike, which is a perfect time to segue into my next point. I actually don't even know where to start.
The problem with that argument is minimum wage. Similar to as is discussed about Immigrants coming to United States of America or any other country also provides people the money to spend. So shouldn't it also increase jobs? The argument again will rest on the practical aspects, which effect will dominate, and that can only be answered by empirical data.
With this one. I mean, this one's just bizarre. Not that they're claiming countries with open borders in Europe are shitholes, because Europe pretty self-evidently is a bad place right now, but that they're blaming it on the immigration. Firstly, there's no logical connection between any border policy and crime, even according to the arguments proposed by border advocates. So as we've established, people seeking economic opportunity have a legitimate incentive to avoid legal customs. I mean, it's not even that complicated. It would be like having a neighbor move from a small town to your neighborhood in the city right next door seeking employment. Why would you assume he's any more likely to commit a crime than anyone else?
The problem with that idea is that it does not sufficiently capture what happens on the macro scale. When moving from one culture to another, it is very hard to adopt to the new cultural norms and the laws present in the society. The person moving to the new culture may simply not agree with many laws and the norms that are present there. This is not surprising considering that people within one's own culture may find it difficult and may be unhappy to adopt to some cultural norms. This can be an explanation why refugees coming here tend to commit more crimes because they are not suited to the norms and the values in the new society. They have different values, and their values are in opposition to the society that they are immigrating to. For example, consider that you are habitual to a drug and you live in a country where that drug is legal. However, if you immigrate to a country where that drug is illegal, but because it is illegal, the population is not accustomed to that drug like you will tend to try to obtain that drug in that country more than the natives of that country. Because the drug is illegal in that country, you are more likely to commit a crime.
Best case you can make is the one that's often made, which is that immigration needs to be restricted because some immigrants can turn out to be criminals, which is simply guilt by association and effectively puts into law a policy where innocent people have their rights stripped away from them because of crimes committed by criminals.
This is actually the most important statement here because the argument against much authoritarianism goes exactly like that. It is true that authoritarianism strips innocent people of many things which may be called rights by anarchists, but may be called privileges, but may be called freedom, essentially, so as to prevent some harm that may come out of it because of people who are not that good using that thing. Now, does it mean that every liberty should be restricted because it can be used by the people who are not good? It does not follow from the idea that one does not take liberty to be supreme principle, that he does not recognize any value of liberty. One may recognize value of liberty, but may not hold liberty to be the final principle or the supreme principle. This is the difference between an authoritarian and a libertarian. Many libertarians think that an authoritarian is against liberty, when in fact an authoritarian is not against liberty, but he is not for just liberty either. There are many values that may be in conflict with liberty, and perhaps we have to limit liberty to sustain those values.
Arguing for borders based on crime rates uses the exact same fallacious reasoning behind arguing for gun control, yet
The difference here is that the ownership of gun is protected by Second Amendment, and the immigrants may not be protected by the rights offered by the state, because the rights in many cases are afforded only to citizens. This is the state's conception of rights. It is the way that we have been talking about rights since centuries.
somehow border advocates mostly seem to be able to see through that one. Stranger still is that most of them acknowledge the legal privileges that immigrants receive. In the case of Sweden, migrants receive the equivalent of $3,000 a month in welfare from the government, and police pretty much in all of these countries are given stand-down orders or are discouraged from stopping migrants when they commit crimes. Not only this, but most of these countries in question don't even have an armed population able to defend themselves and deter criminals. So they understand that all of these problems which are supposedly caused by immigration are actually caused by the welfare state and laws which enable criminality enforced by the governments in these countries.
But is all of the crime increase attributable to welfare state and stand-downs? This is not entirely clear, and it does not appear to be true. What seems to be more likely is that whereas population moves on from one culture to another culture, it carries its culture with it. So it does not recognize the validity of the laws of the second country, just like you do not recognize the validity of the laws of countries and think that they are basically expression of authoritarianism. Most of them, not all perhaps, because your belief system stands in contradiction with those values of the rest of the society. If there is a friction between the values, then there always will be a problem. How to address that problem is an interesting question, but the difference in values do create problems. Now the question is who is right and who is wrong. Is the West right and the problem is just with the immigrants? Or are the immigrants right and the West is basically too blind to see the problems in its own society? It is very hard to argue which is the case, and opinions are all over the place.
But even more bizarre is that they often acknowledge this, then turn around and blame it on a degenerating culture, within the same sentence more times than not.
After case of mass molestations, rape and sexual assault, after skyrocketing migrant crime figures, after numerous attempted and completed terrorist attacks, Germany must finally be taking strong action to halt the spread of Islamism within its culture, right?
Which is a non sequitur, but that's the narrative which is parroted so often, it makes me wonder whether they actually are thinking through their arguments, or they're just parroting it because someone they like said it.
The right seems to be playing like the left here. Nothing else?
I actually used to be a Trump supporter before I became an anarchist, and I can tell you that my reasoning was based on ignorance. Not saying that if you support borders that you base your position on ignorance, only speaking from my own perspective. But I digress. The irony of border authoritarians making arguments appealing to culture and denigrating their opponents by reasoning that they don't care about culture is not lost on me. As we've established, the principles of borders can't be defended, and to say that you need authoritarian borders in order to have a defined culture, border advocates are effectively saying that the culture they seek to establish is one which is inherently a product of coercive violence, which is inherently illegitimate, and where no one has any rights.
It is not true that in an authoritarian culture no one has any right. However, one thing also to notice that culture is always formed by some sort of coercion. That may not be a physical coercion, it is coercion nonetheless. If in a culture everyone is free to do what they like, then what does it mean to have a culture? A culture is formed by similarity of interests. Now some voluntarists say that a culture may be formed if people who have similar enough views form a society together. That is right. But what happens after a few generations? Do the children of the parents have the same views? The culture will become diluted over time, so a long-standing stable culture is not possible without authoritarianism. All authoritarianism is an attempt to conserve. Even the liberals who want to protect their liberalism from the invasion by refugees, as they term it, are conserving. They are new conservatives, you may say. They are trying to conserve their liberal utopia or their liberal world from what they believe to be a barbaric invasion.
Tell me, does that sound like a culture which you want to establish? Just anyone, do you want to be cucked like that? So,
The expression of power is basically a normal human desire, and it has nothing to do with being curbed.
while some opponents of borders may not have principles and do believe in cultural relativism, nihilists, etc., it's actually the libertarians that oppose borders who care the most about culture and seek to establish a desirable culture by opposing state tyranny, authoritarianism, and properly defining rights within society. Alright, well that's all for today's video. If you liked it, then please comment, rate, and subscribe, and I will see you all next time.
From watching the video, we see that there is some sort of an acceptance that the culture can be saved by no authority, which has never been done before. It is surprising that many anarcho-capitalists take that for granted which is not tested, and perhaps which will not remain the same in the new civilization. One important thing to note in the overall video is that while the perspective of the anarcho-capitalist in the economic sense is strong, in the cultural sense it is almost entirely unclear. If you have a culture that is solely free of coercion, how do you even manage to make people follow certain things that are considered good? One of the classic ways in which anarcho-capitalists answer this question is by either adopting a method of social shaming and social praise or by voting through wallets. Both of these ideas are flawed, as we know from the situation that we have today in the modern society. While the idea of voting through wallet perhaps could make some sense, because in a free economy the impact on the companies by voting through the wallet will be much larger. However, one must keep in mind that if a culture becomes so bad that even the values that are considered good now and which may be believed to be good by ISO are in such a minority that it doesn't matter if the business loses those customers, then there is no recourse. The idea of giving away power also gives away the chance to remedy an evil. Is it a fair bet to take? Is it a fair gamble to play? Without an anarcho-capitalist world that is actually existing in the real world, it is impossible to know what will be the consequences of that. Authority, in all its essence, whether it is liked or disliked, is basically a tool to have some form of consistency and conservatism of some values in the society. Because without conservatism and consistency, there is another chaos. And to prevent that chaos, one needs to exercise some power. That is the whole point of masculinity, which is the taming of the nature using power. In all religions and ethical descriptions of mankind that have ancient origin, man is shown as a person who is trying to overcome the adversity in the world through his power. That is somehow lost on the modern civilization because there are not enough threats that make us consider the value of power. However, have we evolved enough with the technology that we can actually control things that are programmed in us by thousands of years of evolution or millions of years of evolution, no matter what you believe to be the origin of the universe? Whether you are a creationist or an evolutionist, one must recognize that there is an essence of humanity, and that essence of humanity may not always be most comfortable with the idea of liberty. Freedom in that sense basically creates a moral hazard. Freedom itself is not a good thing. Virtue is a good thing, and freedom allows virtue to take place, but freedom also allows vice to take place. And is freedom so important that we can't forget about the harms of the vice? Perhaps, and perhaps not. But what is clear indeed is that in a freedom oriented world, there would be vice, and there must be a way to counteract it, because it is the vice that degenerates society and makes it suffer a slow decaying death. Virtue, by definition, is something to be sought because it is, in its very essence, greater than vice. And it is in the benefit of the society and humanity at large to cultivate virtue. From that perspective, freedom looks like a devil's bargain, wherein you eat the apple to get free but are not mature enough to handle that freedom, and so you squander that off, resulting in a humanity that is fated to suffer for eons because of a mistake of their forefathers.